Clark with the Florida GovCon podcast, and I'm here today with Wayne Leland of nPerspective, and we're going to talk about rates, historical, provisional, and proposal rates. Those are indirect rates that are used by federal government contractors. So welcome, Wayne. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Jenny. How are you doing?
So far, so good. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we can help small businesses and federal contracting be more competitive. So we've known each other for a while. You were with me most recently at the Florida GovCon Summit here in Tampa in March, and we were both on a panel related to cost issues for federal contractors. And I always like hearing what you have to say because the rest of us will talk about accounting, and you always stand up and give people a war story, and they listen to you, which I really like. So, Wayne, I know you've been a DCA auditor, and you're involved mostly with federal contractors now, but you're part of a larger group. Can you tell people a little bit about you and nPerspective and what you do?
Sure, and the Florida GovCon event was a great event, and I'm looking forward to the one next year as well. I just want to compliment you on that, first of all. And
thank you.
Yeah, I'm with nPerspective. We do CFO consulting, and I think we're up to about 14 partners now, and each partner has over 20 years experience working for large companies, and we cover numerous industries. My niche is the defense contractors because I'm an ex-DCA auditor. We help build the accounting systems to calm the government auditors down and stay in compliance with all the federal acquisition regulations. Mm-hmm.
Well, that sounds good, and it's such a big need, and there's so many federal contractors across the state of Florida, especially on the I-4 corridor from Tampa to Orlando and then up on the Space Coast. There's so much growth out there that we really want to make sure that we're supporting that community and providing the expertise they need to grow. So the guts of what we're talking about today are indirect rates, and those are calculations like your fringe rate, your overhead rate, your G&A rate. So we'll be going through some definitions. We'll talk about how they're used, when to change, and how you notify people about that. So Wayne, can I ask you to really just kind of give people an overview of what indirect rates mean and how companies use them when they're working with federal contracts?
Sure. The three main rates that we run into where a lot of the confusion happens is the historical rates versus the provisional / forward pricing rates, and then the third set of rates that we run into a lot are the proposal rates. And as I like to call these three sets of rates, my last year's rates, my this year's rates, and what happens if I win this proposal rates. And so if you're using the wrong set of rates, it could have devastating effects to the company. I was at a networking event a while ago, and a CEO and an owner of a defense contractor, we were talking, and he said, yeah, I'm not happy right now. He said, I just found out I owe the government $180,000. And the explanation to me was we were using the wrong set of rates. And so, I have to get some clarity on that, Jenny. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you're right about that. People, when they talk about indirect rates, they say, well, don't I have to use last year's rate? Well, it depends on the purpose of that. Could you explain a little bit about each of these different ones, starting with historical? How do people decide what historical rates to use? How far do they have to go back? What do they do with their new company? How does the historical rate side work?
Okay, the historical would be your last year's rates, and those are going to be your actual rates. So those have to be rock solid. So your accounting system has to be set up. Your pools and bases have to be accurate, compliant, complete, and timely. And so those rates come right out of your financials in this last year's, off of last year's income statement, usually, and your pools and bases come out of that, and those rates are set up for that. And so those are used for the government to come back in after the contract is closed and make sure that you've got everything in the right bucket and all your unallowables are identified and moved to the right place. And they can come back with 20/20 hindsight and update your costs and tell you that you may or may not owe the government some money before they close the contract out. your cost type contracts.
That makes sense, Wayne. I also think that it helps people really analyze how much they made on each of the different projects once they have their indirect rates for the last fiscal year. They can go back and say, how much money did we make on these T&M contracts, how much on this fixed price, and how much on this cost plus. So that historical is really important to figure out what your profitability is and what your actual profit was. So tell me a little bit, Wayne, about provisional or forward pricing rates. I mean, not everybody has forward pricing rates, right?
Correct. Usually it's only the large companies. Effectively, the rates are similar, albeit equal. Forward pricing rates are formal agreements with the ACO and DCAA, what your forecast looked like, and bottom line those rates and say, okay, yes, and here's a formal agreement. Provisional rates are usually used by smaller companies that don't have that formal audit or the formal agreement and not required to have that per the FAR, but it's the same concept. Your provisional rates are this year's rates, and if you have a cost type contract, what the government's going to want to see is where you are at year end, not where you were last year, because your company may have changed and you need to forecast / budget your indirect costs for, like currently we're in 2017, so it would be what 2017 would look like December 31st looking backwards. And those are the rates that they want you to use when you're billing on your cost type contracts, because at the end of the day, those are the rates they're going to hold you to, and hopefully those provisional rates that you estimate for 17 will come in very close to your actual rates for 17. And if they don't, then the government will, again, 2020 hindsight, they'll get to go back and make you adjust your provisional rates, your billing that you bill the government, back to your historical rates. So the goal would be to break even on your forecasted rates compared to your actual rates for this year, and those are your provisional rates. Jenny, thanks.
Okay, so Wayne, what you're saying is your provisional rates are really where you expect to be by the end of your current fiscal year, and you have to write a letter to somebody to say what the rates are. Do you send it to your ACO and DCAA, or who do you send it to first?
Good question. The answer is yes. If you have a cost type contract, the ACO will require you to submit those provisional rates, and you would submit them to the ACO and copy DCA on those rates, and then the ACO will make a determination if he wants DCA to come out and audit those rates, or they may just keep them on file and do a desk review of those rates if they think they're reasonable. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of confused about that because I do talk to people a lot about provisional rates. And I had a situation where we did a budget for our provisional rate 2017, and DCAA ended up looking at that, but then said, tough luck, you've got to use what you had for 2016. So what did we do wrong, or what should we have done differently, or is that just the way it is sometimes?
Well, potentially the issue could be that your forecast for this year was not up to date. So if they don't have any information, or the information is not accurate in their eyes, and you don't, first you have to start with your historical, and you have a good baseline, and from that you will roll out your 2017 forecast, and that's what DCA will rely on. So if your company has for their forecasted rates, and if they want to change their rates, then you literally have to come up with a whole new set of rates and a whole new forecast and submit that forecast to DCAA so they can audit your assumptions. And if you're changing your rates, they could ask you to do a cost analysis before and after to see what the impact is on your current cost type contracts to see if there's any detriment to the government. But the key is you'll have to update your budgets, your forecasts, formalize those, put them in a formal forecast, and put in your assumptions and be able to defend your assumptions. And once you do that, then DCA normally, if your assumptions are reasonable and they make sense, And again, we're trying to get to the right answer. What's the right, my big deal with my clients and people I talk to, what's the right answer? Once we know what we're going to, at the end of the year, this is where we're going to end up, and this is the most current, accurate, complete information. Okay, well then what do we have to do now to update either the provisional rates or our records, or what we need to do to get to make sure this thing is going to get to the right answer? And then once that happens, then yeah, well, I'll talk to anybody and argue with anybody about it, because we all want the same thing. We want current, accurate, complete information, and we want accurate financials. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I think that makes a lot of sense, and maybe what I need to do is advise this customer to get their cost in through May and do a projection through the end of the year and resend that to DCAA and start talking to them about it, because my concern is the company has grown so much and they've added effectively an overhead pool since they started last year, because they've got a lot more recruiting and support cost and overhead that we've really got to get back to DCAA. And I guess the other thing about it is the situation the company ran into is because they didn't have provisional rates established, their first billing was being rejected. And so they had to stop and say, oh my gosh, we're 6 or 8 weeks into this contract, we can't bill because we don't have provisional rates approved with DCAA. Let's call DCAA and start going through that process. And nobody wants to get into a situation where they can't bill because there's nothing established. And I feel like we almost took the fallback position of, we know what 2016 was, so let's use that and let's readdress it when the time is right. That's something people have to look at on a regular basis. And the bigger the company gets, the more critical it is, because that's when you have those $180,000 surprises. So
exactly.
What about proposal rates? Don't they just have to use their provisional rates for proposals?
Good question there as well, and there is a lot of confusion with that because DCA, once you submit your provisional rates, this year's rates, they'll tell you you have to use these rates going forward for your billing purposes. And it's a little confusing because clients and prospects say that, no, DCA said I have to use these rates for everything going forward. Well, if we drill down into that, technically they say you have to use these for your billing purposes for that current fiscal year. So the proposal rates are mutually exclusive, and your proposal rates will be based on your updated forecast. And I tell clients it's going to be, when you do that forecast, it may not look anything like your provisional rates. Coincidentally, it might if the company doesn't change much, but usually if you have a significant proposal and you want to submit your rates for that proposal, you're going to plug into that forecast as if you had won this contract. So if you're a $5 million company and you've got a $1 or $2 million award that you're proposing on, no, your company is going to change substantially. Your base is going to go up. You're going to hire people. That's going to happen, and your indirect rates are not going to go up proportionally usually. So if that's the case, then that proposal rate would be based on a brand new forecast, again taking the historical rate as your baseline and then dragging that to the right for the next 12, 14, 18 months, whatever the period of performance is with that proposal, and then you plug in your assumptions. We're going to hire another person in the accounting department, so G&A is going to go up, et cetera. Our direct labor is going to go up substantially. You plug in all those assumptions and run your rate model off of. Could be substantially different, and then you just have to defend your assumptions, and usually if they're reasonable and logical, DCA would accept those for that proposal.
That makes a lot of sense. I think what you're talking about is just being able to show the impact of, if you've got a 50-person company and you're going to add 30 direct labor employees, and maybe you only add one person to overhead, and maybe you don't even have to add anybody to the accounting staff or human resources because you've already got the capacity. That's going to drive your G&A rate down a bit, and your overhead will still stay reasonable. That would make a big difference. The other thing I've always felt like is when I prepared those rate models, and there's always a tendency to look at and say, well, if we win this contract, here's what the impact is. But I've also had people say, well, you've got to take into account, you've got 4 proposals out. What if you win those? But you don't have to put those other proposals in, the probability of winning those other proposals into this proposal set of indirect rates, do you?
No, you don't have to, and there's a large risk if you do, because you'll potentially drop your rates substantially for this proposal. And then if you don't win those other pipeline contract proposals, then you got to live with these rates because you proposed a much lower rate. So usually you err on the side of conservatism and just plug in that one proposal and live with those rates. If you win that, then yes, we can perform using these rates because they're going to be lower than our current rates. And if we don't win it, then we're still okay because we're back to our provisional rates for the current year. But to put in multiples of what ifs, it gets very risky.
That's kind of what I thought too, because I know that several years ago I was working as a CFO for a company, and we were on a growth curve, and once things started to slow down, they really slowed down fast. And so in order to try to keep what we thought would be our rates, I would include some of those probabilities, and that was a major learning experience for me, because when those contracts didn't start, they didn't start on time, or we didn't win them, we were really in trouble. And I feel like, especially in today's world, knowing that there's so many proposals that come up, contracts, RFP, the contract's awarded, then you have to allow time for a protest, and you have to allow time for something else. Then there are other delays. And so I try to recommend to people to be extremely conservative with those rate models and not put people in the rate model until they actually start working, because otherwise you're going to become overly optimistic, and a small delay that makes it 10 people started, instead of starting on May the 1st, they don't start till September. That could blow away a lot of your assumptions. It's going to set your profitability, and that's really what we're getting down to. Is it's great to have indirect rates. You need to use that to figure out how much it's going to cost to perform the contract. But once the contract is awarded, it's up to you to manage the indirect rates, because if you don't, it's going to come out of your profit. There's no way it can get around not doing that. If you overrun a rate, if your fringe rate was supposed to be 25 and it turns out to be 30, there are going to be cases where you're not going to be able to recover that additional cost. So what we're really talking about then is, how do you manage rate? So this is a chart that I've got when I'm explaining a little bit about the conflict inside a company when everybody's trying to do their best to explain how indirect rates work for pricing proposals. You're trying to go to management and explain, here's where we are in indirect rates, so here's what the profitability is of the company through the month of March. And then they also want to know, okay, we've got to submit information to DCAA about what our rates were for last year. It gets very confusing. So this model that I've got current, which is the fiscal year. It's not where my rates are in March, it's where I expect to be by the end of the year. Nobody measures mid-year, well, no small businesses do, mid-year rates. You always want to be looking at what's my current through the accounting periods that I've closed, plus what's my budget through the end of the year, so where do I think I'm going to end up? And I always recommend to people that they try to set up a budget and not update the actuals but once a quarter, because otherwise it's just too much of a moving target. Historical, as Wayne was saying, is where you were at the end of last year, and you've got to have a consistent way to calculate your indirect rates so you get some value of saying, here's where we were for last year, here's where we are now. Why is there a difference? Did G&A go up because we added people? Did fringe go up because we added benefits, or we set up a 401k, or we've changed the leave balances or the leave accruals, or have we acquired a bunch of senior employees on an incumbent program that make our rates go up? Forecasting is where we expect to be over this year and next year and future years, and for a small business that's really hard to project or to predict. And when somebody gets a proposal that has fill out your rates for the next 5 years, boy, that's going to be tricky to do, and you don't want to put a lot of increase increase or decrease in that because you don't have enough information. As Wayne said, be very conservative. And the left corner that I've got in the bottom that says business development, the projected rates, those are the guys that are always running in and say, we got to win this bid. I want you to drop the G&A. And what we in the accounting world need to be able to do is give management the information to say, if you want to decrease these rates, here is the risk you're taking. Here's how much profit you could stand to lose if you don't, because if you overrun your rates, it's got to come out of profit. When we talked about this little chart that I had, and I think you said you've got something similar. So how about talk to us a little bit more about these different indirect rates that you have to consider in your company at all times?
Sure. And that's, as CFO consultants, that's what we do for clients. And sometimes I tell my clients, they say, well, this is just onerous that DCA and FAR makes us do all of this and all this forecasting and et cetera, et cetera. And my response is, it makes you a better company. Large companies, they all do this and they all live and die by their budgets and their forecasts, et cetera. Smaller companies, it's an overhead, it's a G&A, it's not a direct cost, and so it gets put on the side until you're forced to spend the money to update your infrastructure so you can have a system in place that effectively predicts the future, and that's what you want. And then as the year progresses, like you said, once a quarter, yeah, that would be the minimum. I wouldn't do it any more often than that. And usually it's an event that happens in the company that you have to go and update that forecast. Like you land that big proposal, you're a $5 million company, you just won that $2 million and it's starting in July. So now you're going to be a $7 million company annualized for that year. Well, no, that's going to affect your rates. And when that happens, it affects your cost type contract rates because you've got your provisional rates in there where you're billing the government every month at these rates. And if your rate goes down, then effectively you're overbilling the government. In my example, for the last 6 months of the year, and that's where you can end up with a surprise at year end because they're going to, again, 2020 hindsight, look back at your actuals and say, yeah, because you landed that contract or for whatever reason, your rates dropped in the last 6 months. So you're effectively overbilling us. And the cost type contracts, another concept that we have to keep in mind is that most of my clients do not have true cost type contracts. They're cost type contract, cost plus fixed fee to a max. And to me, what that means is heads the government wins, tails you lose. Because what happens if you overcook your rates and they're too high, at the end of the year, you've completed the project with less hours and with higher rates, and the government can say, okay, you owe us the money back because your rates were higher than expected. And if your rates are lower, then you could potentially overrun, if your rates are higher, you can overrun the contract. So anyway, if your rates are incorrect and you overbill the government, you have to write a check back to the government. If you underbill the government, I got that backwards as well. We'll have to edit that.
I know
out.
exactly what you were saying, though, and people really just have to think about that. You want to manage to the rates as much as you possibly can. When you get it wrong, there's an impact. Either you're going to owe the government back money or you're going to overrun the contract if you didn't manage as you went along.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, if you can plug in that, that'd be good.
And the other thing that I'm looking at is as far as forecasted rates, which is at the bottom right of this circle, what kind of forecasting do you see people doing? Are a lot of people trying to forecast a couple years out, or is there any accuracy to it?
Yep, another good question. And all you can do is the best you can with what you have to work with, and DCA is going to look at that as well. And if your forecasts are way too detailed 5 years out, DCA knows that that's not realistic. So usually you'll take your baseline. This year we know what it looks like. Your provisional rates are going to be reasonably accurate, and assuming there aren't any substantial changes to the company, maybe a year out with some escalations in there, and you can put in some assumptions that certain events are going to happen next year. From that point forward, normally we would just come up with reasonable escalation rates for the direct and indirect costs, and leave it at that, just because it's that's about as good as we're going to get as far as predicting the future.
I think the other thing that people are not maybe realizing as they're doing this is when you're creating a set of rates that you use for the proposal, and the proposal goes in and the work doesn't start for 6 months and it's a 5-year contract, you're really setting a budget going forward for 5 years. And if the rates you used when you bid that contract are too low, you're not going to make any money on the contract. If they're too high, it's a slightly different situation, and you might be able to work with that. But when margins or profit on these government contracts is fairly thin, unplanned things that you have no control over, like increasing costs of health care or other unexpected things, will really have a big impact, so you have to be very conservative about it. The other thing I was going to ask you, though, Wayne, is in working with people that are preparing proposals, you know, they always come in and want you to, can we get this G&A rate down? What do you say to them? How do you explain what the options are to the owner so they can make a decision on how aggressive they want to be on pricing?
Be careful what you ask for is usually what I say. That, and I've said this 100 times before, that to clients in the proposal stages, some of the best business that you do may be business you don't do. If your company is not built, doesn't have the infrastructure for service work, and you're competing against companies that have virtual offices and don't have the brick and mortar costs that you do, and you're trying to get your rates down to compete with them, that's a fail. I mean, because you have to produce once you put those estimated costs in there, unless you're planning on right-sizing the company to get that work. So it's sometimes more of an art than a science, but at the end of the day, you have to live with these rates, and you have to say that, you know, but for me, I'd rather have all these discussions during the proposal phase rather than 6 months into the contract and find out that, no, we can't perform under this. I had a client that thought they were very competitive with their rates, and they knew the work, and they had past performance, et cetera, and they were underbid by 20%. And a year later, the contractor that landed the contract couldn't perform under the contract. They just couldn't do it. They were going out of business because of that. So, and that's a risk. But the government looks at that usually. But for your company, you have to make sure you can live with those rates, and you can be a little aggressive, et cetera. But bottom line is if you're going to drop those rates, and you know that probably we probably will be incurring more of that G&A, well, it's going to come straight out of the profit. So if your projected profit is 7, 8, 10%, whatever that profit is, and you overcook those costs, effectively they're going to come right out of that. So instead of a 10% profit on that, then we're going to come in at about 7 or 6 or 3. And those are the conversations that I don't like to have after the fact, you know, after the contract is awarded and it's in place and we're not performing like we thought we were. So that's why I'd rather, if you're going to do that, you have to go in with your eyes wide open, that there are some risks in forecasting to get those rates lower, or you're going to have to right size the company to get in line with those rates that you did forecast.
I think those are really good points of, you know, making sure it fits your strategy and the type of work you're going after so that you can be profitable, because if you're not profitable, you run out of cash and you start having your choices limited on how your company grows. So, Wayne, can you give some examples of what has happened when people get it wrong?
Well, the $180,000 issue that I was talking to that CEO about was effectively his rates. His rates dropped substantially. He landed a huge contract early in the year. They used their historical rates from the prior year, didn't update anything, thought they were rocking along fine, and they were billing the government on a monthly basis with the rates that were just too high. So, you know, at the end of the year, because their base increased substantially, et cetera, their rates dropped, and those cost type contracts, they went back and retroactively adjusted them and said, yeah, I mean, you put in your G&A rate at 22%, and you came in at about 12%. And so, you added that 22% to every bill you sent in, and those weren't your actual rates. And so the government just does the math on a allowable cost worksheet, and is what it is. And they get to go back and look at your actual. So again, that's where your forecast, the more accurate the forecast, the more successful you'll be. And the CFO consultants, that's what we do. We do CFO planning, and that's what the CFOs do. They protect the assets of the company. They look at the future. They adjust, monitor, and keep things in line. So that's probably the best example that I have. I mean, there's numerous examples of that. That's probably the clearest one I could talk about.
Well, I think what you're also saying is it's going to have a dollar impact, and taking $180,000 and writing a check, that's a pretty big impact on your cash flow. And it also involves a lot of paperwork because you've got to prepare this information, submit it, get it approved, wait for the approval, come back, reissue invoices, and do all kinds of adjustments. So it's definitely a lot easier to try to stick with a plan where your provisionals are pretty close and they average out by the end of the year, rather than having to rework it. Because I always tell people when there's a mistake, it takes 3 times the effort to get it right than it would have to do it right in the first place. So Wayne, I really appreciate your, go ahead.
Right, I just want to throw in one last point, and your customer's not going to be happy as well. If they give you a $3 million contract and you leave $500,000 on the table because you miscomputed your rates along the way, that's going to impact your future business with that customer. I have seen that happen as well. Mm-hmm.
Right, because they were planning on you delivering X and you didn't deliver what you were supposed to deliver. You didn't complete what you could have with the funds that they let you have. So that would be upsetting. And it is all about making sure that you want to show that you're a good steward of the funds that you're given under these federal contractors. So Wayne, thanks so much for being on the Florida GovCon podcast today with me. Really appreciate hearing about your perspective at nPerspective and how you work with clients. So if people need to reach you, what's the best way to reach you, and what kind of services do you offer?
Probably the email at wayne@lb-cpas.com or the website www.nperspective.net, and that has more information on the company and all the other partners as well. And then the phone number is 407-617-0927 if you'd like to contact me directly, and I appreciate you'll let me talk a little bit with you today. Jenny, thanks a lot.
Well, I appreciate having you on, and it's great to have a teammate like you so close by in Orlando. Solvability works with small businesses that are trying to understand federal contracting. I'm more focused on the training side than anything, and helping people understand what they need to do to be competitive, what their options are. And I'm always glad to have Wayne when there is an issue comes up for one of my clients, because I'm not the one that goes and talks to GCA for that client. I want to send the big guns, and that's Wayne. If anybody wants to reach me, the best way to find me is on my website at solvability.com. You can email me at jwclark@solvability. That's solvability.com. So thanks so much, Wayne, and I look forward to working with you again in the future. And next year's Florida GovCon Summit will be in Orlando. We haven't picked the date yet, but it should be late February, early March. So thanks so much, and have a great day, Wayne.
Thanks, Jenny. Appreciate it.